Welcome to the sixth speaker in the 2011-12 Visionaries in Motion series. Our guest this evening, cartoonist and illustrator Charles Burns, continues a vibrant tradition of graphic novelists, cartoonists, and designers featured in our series over the last 6 years. Among them, Myra Kallman, Stefan Sagmeister, and most recently, cartoonist Chris Onstad, Nick Gurewitch, Linda Barry, and Alison Bechtel. Influenced by the parodies of Mad magazine, Hergé's Tintin, and the dark tales of William Burroughs, Charles Burns rose to prominence with early work in Art Spiegelman's Raw magazine. That was in the mid-'80s. He's illustrated covers for Time, The New Yorker, Rolling Stone, and New York Times Magazine. Since 2003, he's been official cover artist for The Believer. His range of publications, and I count 15 or 16 books since El Borba appeared in Paris in 1985, include Big Baby, Skin Deep, Black Hole, and most recently, X'd Out, 2010, the first volume of a trilogy whose second book, The Hive, is slated to appear in October. Remarkable, too, are his many projects, not just his comic creations, but his many projects, from Iggy Pop album covers to ad campaigns for Altoids. In 1992, he designed the set for MacArthur Award-winning choreographer Mark Morris, who restaged The Nutcracker at Brooklyn Academy of Music. He has any number of solo exhibitions of his singular, stark black and white line drawings, full of both beauty and nightmare. His exhibitions have ranged from the Philadelphia Museum of the Arts, Adam Baumgold's gallery in New York City, to a major show in Belgium. A quick glance at the many languages of interviewers and discussions of his work on YouTube gives you just a taste of Burns' global reach, beginning with the publication of El Borba in Paris, 1985, to his 2008 contribution to the French animated feature Peu de Noir, to work with Lorenzo Mattotti's Valvoline collective in Italy. Now, after the talk, Charles will take questions. There are microphones and runners on either side. Use the mics if you can, the roving mics. And continue the conversation with us upstairs at a reception and book sale and signing. Pick up a postcard for the remaining 2 Visionaries this season. And stay tuned, as I mentioned last time, on our website, where you can join past speakers in commenting on what has inspired you about Visionaries in Motion over the past 6 years. Join me, if you will, in welcoming Charles Burns on his own creative visual journey tonight, Drawn in the Dark, The Art of Charles Burns.
I have to close this out here. Thanks for coming on this balmy, summery night. Hold on. I'm getting there. You're seeing a quick preview there. So what I wanted to do is show a lot of slides. What I get asked all the time are about influences and where I got my weird ideas. So hopefully I'll be able to show you a little bit of that tonight. This seems pretty absurd, but one of the first television shows that I ever saw was this very, very crude animation called Clutch Cargo that came out in the 60s. And there was one episode that scared the hell out of me. It was something incredibly benign, but one thing that they did, it was such a cheap animated show, they cut costs by not really animating anything. They just used a stationary drawing and put this very odd-looking real mouth in there to have the characters talk, and there was something very disturbing about that. There were a few occasions where I had to leave the room when Clutch Cargo was on. Our household, in our house, we really didn't watch that much TV, to tell the truth. My parents believed in books, and we had a house that was filled with books. And I had an older sister, but I spent a lot of time by myself and a lot of time entertaining myself, and by looking at books. And in preschool, I would pick up books that were around and examine them. I would look at things like this. This was a National Geographic book, or an illustration from a National Geographic book about life in ancient times. And it's very disturbing. There was just imagery I didn't know what to think of. It was like incredibly violent, beautiful painting of this scene, this gory scene. I don't know. I still don't know what to make of this. I've never read the actual book, but I sure spent time examining these fish people that are administering, I don't know, medicine or something to this guy. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that I was looking at these images before I knew how to read. And I was really making up my own stories about the meaning behind these images. This is an illustration from a book that I picked up, from my father's books. It's an illustrator called Boris. I'm going to pronounce it poorly, but Artsy-Bashev, I think. And still, for me, is like this this stunning image. He was an illustrator. Did a lot of Time magazine portraits, but he did these very oddball, surreal thing. I think this is for the steel industry. Again, looking at, my dad had a book on comics, or a book about comics, and it included this image by Daumier. And I know that I had really bad nightmares about just thinking about headless corpses and little child corpses. It was a very, it was such a potent image. It was potent when it was, potent for an adult to look at, but for a child, I think it really internalized some of these pieces. And even something like this, my dad was interested in art. He had books about comics, books about how to make your own comics. He liked sculpture. He was kind of a hobbyist, but he was interested in a lot of different things. So he had books around that were kind of how-to books, how to illustrate, how to do watercolors, how to do all sorts of things. And I would look at those. This was like some illustrations about how to do folds in clothing. And in my imagination, I was looking at these things and realizing these were clothing that didn't have any people in them. They're almost like these ghostly creatures that were headless creatures walking around. I had a vivid imagination. One of the odd things that my father had were these reprints of Mad comics that were written originally by Harvey Kurtzman. So before there was Mad magazine, there was a series of color comics that came out in the early 50s. And they were parodies, they were short stories that were parodies of popular American culture, whether it be movies, books, television shows. But again, if you keep in mind that I didn't know how to read, and I didn't know what the parodies were of, I was just looking at the pictures and finding my way into these very kind of strong black and white images, very potent images. For example, I had no idea who Wonder Woman was in this parody. Originally, this story was in color, and these guys were actually wearing skin-tight clothing. But in black and white, they looked just like kind of very menacing, naked guys with a submachine gun pointed at this voluptuous Wonder Woman. So I had no real point of reference to any of these things. I mean, look, this is a parody of a Sherlock Holmes story, The Hounds of the Basketballs. And there's something very moody and intense about just the atmosphere of the scene for me. I love the kind of dark shadows, these characters emerging out of the shadows like that. And I know that this kind of imagery really was embedded in the back of my head. This is a good one. I mean, my favorite part of this is the lock that gets broken on the drop seat, this disgusting butt that's bursting out. I don't know. These are for, comics for children. Anyway. One thing, as I mentioned before, one thing my father did was he kind of dabbled in all kinds of hobbies. And one thing, like I said, he was interested in comics, so he would copy comics occasionally. So one thing I remember him working on was this copy of these 3 panels, which was a parody of Flash Gordon called Flesh Garden, and it appeared in Mad Magazine. And I think just looking at his, I wish I still had the original. I think he tossed the original, but he was using pen and ink, and he was working on board, and he could letter very well, but he was pretty much doing a tracing of the drawing and then inking it in himself. But I think just by looking at his original artwork or seeing this kind of physical object that someone had made, I had some sense that comics were made by a person. It wasn't just something that appeared in a magazine. It was something that you could do with your own hands. So I kind of witnessed him using a pen, and he had those tools around. I think that was a really profound thing for me to experience at that age. And also, I was also very aware of the fact that he was incredibly talented with his lettering. It just looked impossible for a human hand to do. I was very impressed. One thing he had, and I never really figured it out until later, he had a scrapbook of old, like, snippings. He had of old comic strips from the 40s and I guess into the 50s perhaps. And he was putting together, and I remember looking through and never quite figuring out why he had assembled these images or these pieces. And it wasn't until later that I realized that he was kind of gathering. If you look up at the upper right-hand corner, it says F for female and standing. So he was using these as kind of as a reference guide, so he could copy them if he was going to be doing his own comic. Because I think he had read about that in some how-to comics book, that you need this kind of morgue of images that you could use as reference. You notice that he started to kind of paste in random comics as well. And at some point I noticed too that he was just kind of, assembling a lot of images of just very sexy girls too. And another side of the influences that I had as a kid, a very unusual thing for an American kid for the time that I grew up was to read Tintin. In the late 50s and early 60s, there were 6 books that were published in America. And my dad, once again, bought those for me. And they were truly amazing books. I mean, for me, they still hold up. They're great characters, and the production on them is really pretty amazing. So those were the first books that I had a real sense of like my comics, something that was handed to me, and it was something specifically just for me. There were other comics around my house, like, I don't know, Dennis the Menace and I don't know, Donald Duck and things like that I shared with my sister, but this really felt like something that was uniquely mine. There were 6 books published in the U.S., and on the inside, these are the end papers of the Tintin albums, and what you'd see when you open them up was this cast of characters, and as a kid I would be able to look through and see some of the characters I recognized, but what made me crazy is there's so many other characters that looked really intriguing that I had no idea about, and just imagining those stories was really just had a real strong effect on me. On the back cover, you had this list of the other albums, the other books that were available, and I would look at that, and I would look at that all the time as well. There'd be here's a little close-up. I'd look off into the horizon and see this crumbling castle off in the water there, and just that that would make me crazy just thinking about what that story was. And the fact that I couldn't read that story, would just burn in my mind. And I think that the stories that I imagined were probably more exciting than the actual book when I finally read it. On the other side there, on the same back cover, there were just odd things like this. I didn't know what that was. It was like a mushroom or something, but I didn't even know what a mushroom was. It was just this very odd, abstract thing off there. And so I had to wait many, many years before that mystery was solved. So here's one of my favorite passages of Tintin. And keep in mind, these are books that were read to me early on, but I guess I slowly learned to read while looking at these. But I primarily read them by looking at them. Here, Tintin never looked really upset. You see sweat droplets flying off of him, so you know that he's scared, because you never see him scared. Anyway, ha, 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 ha. Admit it, you're scared. Come closer to the door. Come closer. Come a little closer. Good. Now look, there's an intercom. So, of course, I don't know what an intercom is. I've never seen an intercom in my life. I have no idea what the concept is. When I'm looking at it, I see this voice coming out of the wall, and I see that as a mouth that's kind of inside, embedded into this wall. So there was something very dark and mysterious about a lot of the images that I was looking at that I just wasn't able to interpret at that age. And I was a prime candidate for there was a monster fad in the early 60s. I was just the right age for that. My friends had monster magazines. I had to figure out what I could trade to get copies of those, because I didn't have access to them. There were also things like ugly stickers that Topps Bubblegum put out. And those made me crazy too. I didn't have that much disposable income, so you could only afford a few things. So if you look at the sticker in the middle of Jim, I remember one of my grade school friends realized, he said, I realized you could really draw when you copied Jim perfectly. I was also into, there was a television show called The Outer Limits, and these were some kind of garish cards that were taken from the Outer Limits television show. And they featured a lot of very intense creatures. They were, whereas the Twilight Zone was more cerebral, more a mystery, the Outer Limits was more science fiction-y and outer space creatures, that sort of thing. But you've got if you see the jelly creature on the side there, I remember there's a sequence where he's out in some swampy, some marshland, and he's feeding swamp grass into a little mouth in his stomach. That was a good moment for me. And as I said, as a kid, I didn't have that much access to comics. It was pretty much where you lived. We moved around a lot, so we kind of relying on where your parents took you and what they were willing to buy for you. So early on, there were pretty much the things that were available were mainstream superhero comics. And of course, you kind of had your choice between Superman and Batman. Of course, I opted for Batman because it was kind of darker and weirder. Superman it seemed too easy for Superman. There's just something about the lines and the kind of spookiness of it that I was very attracted to. A little bit later, I got into Spider-Man. This is the early issues that were done by an artist called Steve Ditko, who had a very idiosyncratic way of drawing. Peter Parker. Here's Peter Parker. The very, very early issues, he's always a nerd, but he had really bad glasses. He was nothing muscular about him. He was very, very skinny, and he was just kind of a creep. He was a guy that just, he wanted a girlfriend, but he just couldn't quite manage it. He had to take care of his ailing aunt. And a lot of the stories really were a little bit of a soap opera. And I think at the time, I convinced myself that I was buying those superhero comics or the Spider-Man comics, for the fact that it was like this a story about a crime fighter in a costume. But I realized in retrospect, that I really enjoyed the stories about, his personal life a lot more, the kind of his bad romance, his bad, I don't know, his lack of luck with girls. And here you see, here's like a little headshot. So on the left there, you see Steve Ditko's more kind of primitive and scary-looking Spider-Man, and then they brought in, and when he got fed up with the strip, they hired a new cartoonist, and you can see it's a lot more sanitized. The guy on the right actually knows how to draw a neck properly. And all of a sudden, Peter Parker is driving a motorcycle. He's got girls that are interested in him. He's dancing. He's got 2 girls that are interested in him. So it's like, suddenly, he took on a whole new character. I guess I like the darker, nerdier guy. I could relate to that a little easier. Just about the time that I really, really was fed up with mainstream superhero comics, I was introduced to underground comics. I remember walking the halls. I think it was in ninth grade. When I was in 9th grade, someone said, "Burns, I just saw these comics, and you're going to love them. They're called Zap comics, and they're really dirty." And sure enough, I got my hands on them pretty soon. So this is a comic that was, the early issues were entirely done by Robert Crumb, who's still working and still doing really amazing work. And then later he gathered together other artists to contribute, including, well, a lot of other famous underground cartoonists. His work kind of veered off shortly after that. He was kind of the nice, sweet hippie cartoonist, and at a certain point, he kind of allowed all of his kind of darker side to emerge. So we have big ass comics, weird sex fantasies with the behind in mind. Another one, plunge into the depths of despair. See if there's anything good on. Why bother? And also, I guess it was probably in high school around that time, I discovered some specialty stores that sold old magazines from the 50s, from the 40s and 50s. And so I bought these odd crime comics. And again, these were for kids, but some were pretty gruesome and violent. There was a whole crusade against comics in the 50s, and these were the comics that they were trying to get rid of, and they succeeded. But I succeeded in finding them in the used bin in old comic stores. So we'd pick up the very trashy horror comics, and I also really liked romance comics. I still do. I like they're a little slice of Americana. They're stories that are written by middle-aged white men that are talking and they're supposedly for teenage girls or preteen girls about what they have in store for them. And there's also kind of a darker side that emerged too. There were kind of these kind of, I don't know, bad girls or people that are where romance is kind of going astray. You've got here's a woman who's saying, "And just what must I do for those?" I don't know, great lover romances. They're just kind of sleazy and fun. So some of my this is some of my early work. I did a I'm trying to even remember the title of this comic. Anyway, here's an early piece that was based on some of the romance comics I was looking at. Oh no, how will I face another sleepless night with this terrible image in my mind? Why is it that every time I think about Ron, I have a horrible vision of a burning bed of flesh, all crispy and swollen? Oh yeah, so this was a series called Mysteries of the Flesh, and they were one-page pieces that I was trying to find outlets for my work after I got out of school, and this was in a punk fanzine out of Oakland that was printing these. Here's another one. I finally reached the point where it was impossible for me to face her. I was living a lie that was consuming me from within. Nothing's wrong. It's just that something's come up and I won't be able to see you for a while. Look, I've got to go. I left the water running in the bathtub. Why do you have to lie to her, Brian? You're going to have to tell her about us sometime. and other things I was working on, I was doing some comics or illustrations that were really dealing with not really explicit narratives, but piecing images together. And it's something that I still do. It's almost a collaging of images together. And here I'm looking at some romance comic covers. I'm looking at advertising from the 40s. And you can tell from fairly early on I'm interested in disease, or the idea of disease. This is a comic I did for Raw magazine. Raw magazine was mentioned. It was published in the early '80s by Art Spiegelman, who went on to do Mouse, and his wife Françoise Mouly, who's now an editor of the New Yorker, cover editor, art editor. And they were putting together this big, oversized comics magazine, an anthology. And Art Spiegelman was really probably the first cartoonist, first real cartoonist that I met. He was the first person I feel like really understood what I was getting after. And I remember showing him this piece very early on, along with a lot of other work that I had. And I remember he was looking at it for a very long time, and I was starting to get nervous. And at a certain point, I started trying to explain it. Well, what I'm doing here is, and he cut me off very quickly and said, no, you never have to explain. And after I heard that, I realized that he understood what I was getting at and appreciated it, and I didn't have to explain, which was great. Here's an early watercolor. Again, you can imagine this was probably taken from a romance comic, slightly doctored. This kind of led into this character called Dog Boy. This is published in Raw magazine, and I was living in Philadelphia at the time, working as a waiter in downtown Philadelphia, and I remember just this idea of being a dog boy came to me. I felt like a dog boy coming back on the train. Felt horrible. And so here's a story about, just this short little story about this guy who can't afford a real heart transplant, so he has to opt for having a Labrador dog heart put into him, and he obviously takes on doggy characteristics. And at first, I really felt like it was really kind of a one-liner. Okay, you kind of get, he takes on dog characteristics, and that's it. So here's a little strip that I did. But then I went on to do some other pieces, longer pieces with him. In this case, I kind of placed him in my work environment. I didn't wash dishes, but I was around dishwashers, and I was around that whole kind of the kitchen scene there, and so it made sense to have Dog Boy in there licking the dishes and begging for bones. Here's another early story I did called A Marriage Made in Hell, and this appeared in Raw magazine as well. In this particular story, I was really using the kind of language in a lot of the romance comics that I was looking at. This kind of overwrought language. Our life together continued, a monotonous parody of marriage. Seeds of doubt had been planted in my mind. Was John's story about his physical affliction really a lie? Was he secretly in love with a Hollywood sweater girl? All of my efforts to make our marriage work now seemed useless. What's this, lipstick on his collar? And I know it isn't mine. Sniff, sniff. What's that smell? Why, it's perfume. And what's this funny-looking thing? So this is kind of hard to tell, but this is a cover I did for Raw magazine. And in each issue they had, again, it's a very large, oversized magazine. In each issue they had kind of special things. This issue had a little flexi disc, a little plastic record that was an edited version of a Ronald Reagan speech he sounded a little crazy a lot of the time, but this was an amazing edit where he's talking about cans of poisoned meat that have a attachable Stein handle. I don't know. So anyway, we had to figure out, in this particular cover, we had a die cut, meaning you're looking at the black and white cover and you're seeing the image behind it. So on the cover, we got a vinyl record inside with Ronald Reagan speaks for himself. And I remember being very resistant. I didn't want to draw Ronald Reagan in my comic, but it had to be on there somehow. So I ended up having Ronald Reagan in a picture frame holding a gun to a stake. And during that time, early on, I was also looking anywhere to have outlets to have my work published. And there weren't really that many magazines at that point that were publishing the work that I was doing or was interested in doing. There was a magazine, Heavy Metal, which doesn't seem like it's very appropriate, but it was a science fiction-y sort of magazine that published a lot of European comics. And they started taking American artists. So I started serializing this character, El Borba, who's you can see for yourself, he's kind of an odd, overweight Mexican wrestler. He's got a little mask on, smokes and drinks incessantly, and kind of accidentally solves the cases that he's hired for. He was inspired by, when I was living in California, I would be able to go to Mexican stores that sold Mexican magazines. So I'd pick up these beautiful for me they're beautiful, imported Mexican wrestling magazines. And almost every one of them had these great masks. My favorite was, I don't have a good photograph of it, my favorite was this guy called the Executive who just wore a suit and tie and a mask and came on with a little briefcase into the arena. So this was the first book, a French book called El Borba that collected some of those stories. Eventually, those stories got put together into an American edition called Hard-Boiled Defective Stories. And whenever I got interviewed, it was always hard-boiled detective stories, and I always winced whenever, so I think there's a few times where I was on camera where I was making a face when they said detective instead of defective. Anyway, this is the book dump where it says, buy my book or I'll feed you your face. For the back cover, I created all these little, they're based on pulp fiction magazines, pulp detective stories that came out in the I guess in the 40s. So I did a separate cover for each story. Thrilling defective, crack defective, spicy defective. And this is a more recent collection that Fantagraphics Books put out. It's hard to say. And I couldn't resist to stealing from my favorite author. So I took Hergé's cast of characters or the idea of using that cast of characters, and used that for my end papers of the book. This goes back a little bit further. Early on, again, there's a period where I was looking for any outlet to get my work published, and there was, I can't remember what, I think maybe it was the Village Voice, some weekly periodical, weekly tabloid paper. They had an opening for like a little panel strip like this. So this was my attempt to try to do a gag strip, and I just wasn't very good at it. But this was, I call it Mutantis, and this was published in a small Seattle paper. But on the far right, you see the very first permutation of a character I came up with called Big Baby. Oh, you're nothing but a big baby. I guess that's my idea of a punchline. And this was the illustration I did for a French comics magazine. And early on, the character was pretty nasty, kind of a nasty kid. He's got his air rifle that he gets for Christmas, and you can see his parents in the foreground. But then I realized that I like the character, and I made him a lot more. I kind of placed him in this environment that I grew up in the early '60s, And so he's this much more, I don't know, much more benign character. This is from a story I did called Curse of the Mole Men. It was a little book that was published by Raw Books in the early 80s. And here's you're looking, this is kind of the front and back and spine of the book kind of spread out. And we took, if you're looking at the back, it says, "Meet Tony, an average American kid with everything in the world to look forward to except nightfall. The mom and the dad were islands of sanity in a world they never made. Mr. Pinkster, his obsessive jealousy did not mix well with booze and bullets. Mrs. Pinkster, she wanted love, but all she got was a black eye." So if you opened up the book, there was the end papers. These were the end papers. And I really loved, I always loved the design of books where someone's really paying attention to every aspect of the book as an object. And I love end papers and beautifully designed books. So this was my chance to do that. This is just kind of like looking at the things that would have been in my drawer or what I wish was in my drawer when I was a little kid. So bubblegum cards, comics, robots, toys, plastic spiders. And I did I did a later version of it for another publisher. And of course, on the back cover, I once again stole from Hergé. I even did a version of the text that was on the original American edition. I'll try to read it here, but it's small type. It says, "What you should know about Blood Club. Blood Club is the newest edition in a brilliant series of picture storybooks loved by children and praised by parents and teachers all over the world. Each book in the series tells a complete, exciting story featuring Big Baby, a slightly abnormal American kid whose exploits take him from his own backyard to the darkest recesses of his sweltering brain. Big Baby's devoted readers number in the thousands and include not only children, but a handful of feeble-minded adults. Here are some of the reasons why." And I went on and included some quotes that were taken from the London Times Literary Supplement. And then on the bottom, I added one by Dr. Jerry, where he says, "Pictures within pictures for children who aren't quite sure what they're looking at." And this is another illustration from a recent volume of that's still available that Fantagraphics put out. And of course, I didn't have all those toys, but I wish I did. But we have imagery from the Outer Limits there, some Japanese monsters in the background, Japanese toys, and then this little recreation of a little character that I created when I was a kid, the Little Green Man. And later I was actually able to design some toys. So these are some toys that I created for a Japanese Sony Entertainment in Japan, and these are called Monster Teens, and they're very small. They're maybe that tall, and I remember going back and forth with the people I was working with, and I originally was saying, well, I'll have them all. They'll be like goth kids or something like that, because I had come up with the first one. This green girl there that looks kind of gothy. And I remember having it explained to me, like, the Japanese people do not understand the concept of goth. I thought, that's weird. Why did I see that magazine called Gothic Lolita? Where did that come from? Anyway. So later, I was showing you some of the pieces that I grew up with that were, made by Topps Bubblegum. And later, I actually got to do work for Topps Bubblegum. These are some pieces that were from, I don't think anyone probably knows about Pee Wee Herman anymore, but Pee Wee Herman was very popular, and these were from a Pee Wee Fun Pack. And there's these really ridiculous little masks that would never fit, even the smallest child, but they were fun to do. I did iron-on T-shirt designs that were fun. I didn't come up with the concepts, but I was more than happy to do these. I actually had to, in order to scan these, I didn't have the original artwork anymore, so I actually had to iron these on a T-shirt material to scan them. So that's what you're looking at. When I'm talking about my work, I usually primarily talk about the work that I create all by myself, meaning my comics. But another side of my work is doing illustration. I've always kind of gone back and forth, supporting myself by doing illustration and advertising. And I guess it all feels like it's my work. It's all my work. On the other hand, the work I do, on one side of it's work for hire. It's someone's hiring me and wanting me to execute their ideas primarily, or hiring me for my style. So this is a Rolling Stone illustration about heavy metal. So of course I like robots, so I got to draw a robot. Little Richard, sweating Elvis. Good to see Lou Reed, young Lou Reed. I guess his parents gave him shock therapy because they thought he was gay, or they're worried about him being gay. So got to try to burn that out of his brain. This is Iggy Pop. And I was lucky enough to, I did a few album covers. I haven't done that many. There's something about, for me anyway, there's something about an association with the music and the artwork that appears on album covers that are very, very, they're completely locked together. And I've been offered to do album covers by musicians that I'm just not crazy about, so I usually turn those down. I just don't want to have my work associated with music that I can't stand. So there's been some, I can't remember the names of people that have asked me, but I haven't done that many. But of course, I grew up loving Iggy Pop and the Stooges, so it was my chance to do an album cover for him. The only thing, the funny story here is that it was done by Virgin Records, I guess, and they were a little concerned about the girl smoking the joint on the cover, but then I explained that, well, yeah, there's a song in there about a cute girl smoking a joint. So that seemed legitimate to me. But the character in the center there with the red hair, originally, I guess he looked a little bit too much like Roy Orbison. So Roy Orbison, who I have great respect for, but he had just died recently, and I guess he was on, Virgin Records was putting him out. So I had to doctor him up a little bit so he did not look so much like Roy. It was an odd thing to get edited on. And I've done some very mainstream, some surprisingly mainstream things like Time magazine covers. Usually that has to do with when it's a downtime in the news. You got to have something on the cover. So anyway, we got covers like this, or this, something about the yen. Here's the New York Times magazine. It's funny, there's something that's so iconic about this image, obviously, and I've seen it. I mean, obviously, I was stealing from the original, and then I've seen this actually used, and people have stolen this for, I don't know what they were trying to sell, used cars or something. And I did a couple, I've done a lot of illustrations for the New Yorker, and I did a few covers. This was done around the time that everybody was talking about, I don't know, cholesterol, so. Bad joke. And I don't know. I was always, as far as New York was concerned. My dad grew up in New York in the Bronx, and was interested in Reginald Marsh and people who were showing, I don't know, Coney Island, scenes like that, kind of, I don't know, working class scenes. That was things that I looked at. So I wanted to do something that kind of related to that feel, that time period. Let's look at Coney Island. And this actually, believe it or not, this came close to being a New Yorker cover. But this was actually, it was run in the magazine. They asked a bunch of artists to do their version of the New Yorker mascot, Tilly. So this is Mutant Tilly. So here's getting back to some comics here. I did a number of comics that kept on going back to this idea of, I don't know, a plague or a teen plague, a disease that manifests itself in teenagers. And so this is part of a page from I think it was a 3 or 4 page story where you've got this kid who's got a rash that's slowly creeping up his chest, and he knows that eventually it's going to reach his face and he's going to be outed. Everyone's going to know that he's got the bug. And here's another short piece that I did for Raw magazine. It's more to do with the living dead, I suppose. Walking down a cool, dark road, sad teenagers who won't stay dead. Creepy crawling in through the back door late at night after mom and dad are safe in bed. They stay a while, maybe watch TV, make a sandwich, always leaving something. A stain on the sofa, a clump of hair, a decomposed finger. And always that same odor, hard to define, something wild and rotten, the smell of shallow graves. So initially, I think before I worked on Black Hole, I had a couple of false starts. I had the idea that maybe the story would be about kids coming back from the dead or living out in the woods, having this community out in the woods, and kind of crawling back into, coming back to what's comfortable and normal for them at night. And then it seemed to, I don't know, it seemed more like I wanted to do a story that was really much more character driven, that was much more about I don't know what I was going through at that time in my life and what my friends were going through, or at least what I felt like I was going through. So this is the first page of Black Hole, where you've got this big graphic image. I mean, most people I knew, at least in America, not a rite of passage, but something that almost everyone did a dissection in science class, in biology class. So I wanted to start with that. It was so weird. It happened in my 3rd period biology class. We got divided into groups of 2 because we were going to be dissecting frogs. I lucked out for once and got Chris as my lab partner. Chris Rhodes. She was a total fox. All the other girls were squealing and stuff, and the guys were sort of taking over and putting on the whole tough guy act. I guess I was trying to do the same thing. I went ahead and pinned the arms and legs down like you were supposed to, and was just starting to cut it open when it happened. As the skin opened up, a bunch of formaldehyde spilled out. You could see the guts through the slit I'd made, and they looked all hard and white. I froze. I can't explain what happened. It was like a déjà vu trip or something, a premonition. I felt like I was looking into the future, and the future looked really messed up. Keith? What's the matter? Are you okay? For a while there, I was just floating. It was this totally black totally black place. It felt kind of spacey, but it felt nice and safe. Then it was like things started pushing into the blackness, voices, blurry shapes. I must have passed out. I was lying on my back. He just keeled over, Mr. Fulner. Kaboom. You should have seen the look on his face. And the next thing I know, I'm looking at all these faces. Mr. Fulner was saying something. Back up, give him some air. Keith, what happened? Are you all right? I didn't say anything. I felt like a total dipshit. He must have wimped out looking at the frog guts. Yeah, what a pussy. Everybody was laughing their fucking heads off. Everybody except Chris. She wasn't even smiling. So when I originally was putting together the book, I always conceived of it as a long story, a full story, but I put it out, I serialized it in comic book form, kind of a traditional American comic book format. And one thing I was always aware of, I really wanted, if you're looking at, these are some of the covers, I was always interested in the graphic effect, having a very strong graphic effect with all the images. And I would have the title on each cover, but I didn't put my name on it. I didn't put the publisher's name. I didn't put the price. I really just wanted the artwork to speak for itself. So there were 12 issues that came out serialized to tell the complete story. And here's just to show you a little bit of the way that I work. When I'm working, I use the cheapest school notebooks to take my notes in, either to draw in. I always feel a little intimidated by beautiful sketchbooks. I always feel like I've got to fill them up with beautiful drawings. So maybe I'll do one beautiful drawing and then set it aside. So I always buy like really cheap books, and I guess most of my notes end up being written out, but then I'll just make visual notations. So these I was trying to come up with a cover for Black Hole, and these would probably just be the first kind of scribbled notes that I was making. And I arrived on this idea of this cover. And I make it says, the cover with Frankenstein, famous monsters. So on the right there, you see what I'm referring to, which is like an old cover from Monster Magazine that I'd remembered. And when I'm drawing, the first image is the one on your left here. I start out very, very roughly, almost gestural drawings. There's some drawings that I do that almost look abstract. I'm really putting the basic shapes down. And so I work on layers of tracing paper, so just building up images that way. And then I put another piece of tracing paper on and refine the drawing that way. And so here, I actually flip the drawing over sometime, so you're seeing a mirror image. If any of you draw, you can try that sometime. You can either look in a mirror, or you can, if you have a computer, you can look at it as a scan and flop it over. And you can really see, your brain becomes very adjusted to looking at a drawing after a few hours, and it gives you a clear view, or a clear view of the drawing. So I do that quite often. I'll flip it over so I've got a mirror image of it. So there you have a more tight drawing on the right there, and then on the left, and then on the right you see the inked version of it. And back then, this is before I was working on a computer, I had this odd technique of doing a black and white transparency of the black and white artwork, and then doing the color from behind, almost like an animation cell. And then on the right, you see the final cover. And one thing I was trying to do when I was working on the book too was really thinking about how the book was constructed visually. For each of the title pages, I would have a corresponding image on the left there. And for when you open up the book, open up the comic, I would have end papers that would fill up the entire book. There was end papers in the front and end papers in the back that would be usually slightly different. In this case, the only difference was a little bit of splatter. And this was an issue where there was some reference to a bucket of tadpoles that got bad by the end of the story. This is Rob Fastencanny from my 9th grade art class. If you look really carefully, you can see a roach clip on his lapel there. Keep in mind, this is 9th grade. This is, I'm trying to remember his name. I forget. Anyway, he lived down the street from me, and he was a mouth breather. So another thing I did in the serialized version of Black Holes, there's a page that had copyright and indicia information. I would do this kind of before and after drawing. So this is the guy down the street, and he got what he deserved. And I was taking these from my high school annuals. And this is a really, really nice girl that did not deserve this, but I couldn't resist. She was really nice, good Christian girl. And this is, so it was something I worked on for a long time. It was something Black Hole was serialized, and I never really want to admit how long it took, but it took a long time. But I was bouncing back and forth doing illustration work, so I was always kind of starting and stopping. In a lot of ways, I think it was really helpful to do that. It gave me time to kind of step back and think about the story, and I think a lot of the decisions I made were better because I had time to reflect. So more recently, this is a book that came out in 2010. It's the first book in a series of 3. And if any of you remember that little mushroom image from Tintin, you can see that I haven't stopped stealing. I'm using the exact same format as the Tintin books, and the page count isn't quite the same, but it's pretty close. When I decided I wanted to do a color book, and it made total sense to kind of immerse myself back into to the world of Tintin. So I've got 2 major threads in the story. One that deals with this character who's unnamed in the first story, but we'll call him Johnny 23, and then we've got Doug, who's really his real-world counterpart. It's not really explained, and I'm probably explaining too much now. But here's a little sequence. Pardon, English? Do you speak English? Mouth? Eat? No thanks. Hey, mister, you don't eat that. You don't eat that junk. It'll make you sick. So one thing that I became aware of while I was working on this book is there's something great about the internet, but I was looking up foreign editions of Tintin and actually finding pirated editions. This is a cover of a Chinese version of a Tintin book, The Shooting Star. And something about this, there's something about it that really intrigued me. In a way, it felt like I was the same impression I had when I was a kid looking at, before I could actually read, there was a kind of a mystery there of looking at the text that you couldn't actually read. I remember seeing some French editions of Tintin when I was really young, and I couldn't read French, and it was incredibly frustrating. So it kind of held that same sort of mystery for me. Here's a couple of other Chinese editions that are incredibly bizarre. Tintin shouldn't look that happy holding that gun. It's a little, and Captain Haddock shouldn't look that angry either. So I actually took that idea and created some foreign alphabets and did these kind of fake magazine covers with keeping that in mind. So I did some kind of fake knit, Tintin spelled backwards, Tintin covers. And I actually went so far as to actually do kind of a cut-up version of my story. This is Johnny 23, which was published at the same time as X'd Out, and it was put out by a small French publisher. And I just asked him whether he would do a cut-up version of my story in purple ink with a fake alphabet. So with a friend of mine who knows computers, I did a typeface, a foreign typeface, and just reassembled, did a new story with this fake script, a cut-up, as it were. Little did I realize, it's a real alphabet that corresponds to a keyboard. Little did I realize that someone was going to sit and translate that or break the code. So somewhere online you can find the translation of it, and it's pretty much gibberish. But I was writing in some William Burroughs phrases. I was writing in some obscure things that I was thinking about. So it was interesting for me because I was touch typing and I wasn't really paying attention to what I was writing. So they corrected some of my mistakes, but it's out there somewhere. I'll be like this forever. I'll never find a way out. There's a river flowing under me, dragging me downstream. I'm on a raft. I'm drifting away, swept up in the flood. A raft loaded up with all my crap, all the things I can't seem to let go of yet. We were happy, we really were, at least for a little while. I try to control it, try to focus in on the good things. Waking up with Sarah on a clear, beautiful day, walking with her through Chinatown, the sky impossibly bright and blue. Everything bright and clean and new, but my eyes always drift. I always look down. There's something in my eggs. What, that? That's nothing. Sometimes the eggs get fertilized by accident, but it's no big deal. Hey, it's all protein. If you don't want it, I'll eat it. Come on, get over it. This is a nice, clean place. You got nothing to worry about. And that is that portion. So I'll be more than happy to. Anyone want to put on some lights in here so we can see everybody? No one needs to look at me in the light here. That's better. So any questions? Yeah.
Is X-Dev based on any particular Tintin comic or just sort of a hodgepodge of them all?
There's a, there's just little bits and pieces that find their way in. And it's really just the kind of the images that I internalized. So I was showing you that intercom in the beginning. And if you notice, one of the last pieces here, you see an intercom. So that kind of, those things, whether they're very specific or not, find their way in. I know that people in the U.S. are reading Tintin now, and there's the movie that came out. But over in France and Belgium, it's like so incredibly popular that every single reader of my book instantly knew like what all the most obscure references were. So yeah, I mean it's not necessary to understand the book, but it's just a part of who I am. So it's something that just kind of rose up to the surface and something that I wanted to include.
I read them when I was a kid for what it's worth.
Okay. It's funny. I mean, when I talk to cartoonists my age, none of them really read it. There was a limited run of American books, and I guess they just didn't do very well. And I've never come across someone my age that was influenced by Hergé. But people who are younger, now they're accessible and they've been around for quite a while. So it's much more prevalent. Right there.
Could somebody get the microphone there and on that side, would you mind? See, the microphone is stationary.
Okay. I thought I remembered reading in an interview with you that at one point you had spent a lot of time in museums too, and were looking at a lot of paintings, and I'm just kind of curious, you've been focusing on kind of the comics.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm just curious which painters you responded to.
Well, I skipped around. I mean, I pretty much showed you the most direct influences. I think the things that I really internalized were the things that I looked at, when I was 5 and 6 years old, or something like, or spilling into 7 years old. I think those are the things that bubble up from inside of me. But when I went to college, I studied fine arts. I was like the kid that could draw in school. And I remember going to college. I went to University of Washington. I stayed in Seattle. But, I got in there and I thought, oh, great, I made it here. And I had this very naive attitude that somehow I would study something, and by the time I got out, I'd be an artist. I was clueless. But at that point, I went in and I studied printmaking because that seemed like it was close to drawing. I didn't want to paint. I didn't know anything about painting. And I quickly found out that I didn't know anything about printmaking either. So I bounced around. I did photography. I did sculpture. I was really lucky enough to kind of work my way through all those different things. And you know, there was a point where I did some really bad paintings. I realized I don't have to be a painter. But I looked at a lot of work. My wife's a painter, so you know, we both share an appreciation of going to museums. And yeah, I'm not someone that's just influenced by comics, but I guess if I'm thinking about, I'm thinking of like some of the Chicago Imagist painters. There's a group called the Harry Who that I remember really responding to. They weren't doing pop art, but they were certainly doing work that was influenced by the pop imagery that I'd grown up with, and I still like their work. But then I can look at I don't know, Italian Renaissance painting. I can look at all kinds of things that I enjoy. I try not to limit myself to anything.
I was just wondering what made you choose black and white over color for Black Hole?
It's a story that for me, it could only be in black and white. There was so much about the actual feeling of that black and white. Some of my earlier comics, I used to use gray tones. Like there were some tones that you could cut out and apply to the paper. And I would even do cross-hatching and things like that. But my work slowly moved towards just being purely black and white. And in this case, it really had so much to do with just the character of the story, the feeling of the story. There's it's somehow sometimes just like the texture, there's like a real visceral feeling of what those shapes are, what those images are, just the textures, the forest. It starts to be a real character, for me anyway, of the story, just the atmosphere that's created by the lines. So there's something just about the lines themselves that have a real, they're very important. And yeah, color just doesn't seem like it would enter into the story at all for me. It just seems like it would be wrong. When I approached the story that I'm working on now, I didn't want to just do a colorized version of my black and white work. I really want to utilize color as part of the storytelling. So I've been very aware of that, how I can use the color to tell the story, and that's been really fun, a new thing for me to do. I've also, if you look at the story, a lot of the work is much more open in allowing I'm not using so much black. I'm letting the color work that way. So. Yeah, there's just a real different feeling, a different atmosphere to the character of the pure black and white. There you go.
I've seen many different illustrators and artists who have very similar artistic styles before, but I've seen ones who have many of the similar ones, but ones that also have very different and unique ones. What are some of the most unique ones that you've seen before?
Unique artists?
Well, unique artistic styles for comics.
God, I don't know. I mean, it was mentioned before that I worked with some Italian artists, and when I lived in I lived in Italy for a couple of years in the early 80s, and what was nice was being introduced to a group of artists that had very different influences. Someone was talking about painting, and here it was nice to see a group of artists that most of them did color work and did very painterly looking work, and a lot of their influences were from painting. So it was nice to see that. I mean, most cartoonists that I know grew up with very similar things that same influences. We all were, looking at those kinds of comics that were available to us. So it was nice. It was nice to see those kinds of influences. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just some of the Italian cartoonists that I was aware of early on. It was funny. I was around those guys for a couple of years, working with them, doing work. And I remember at one point, one of their girlfriends said, you've been here for 2 years, your work should start changing. Why isn't your work changing? I mean, you're still doing this black and white stuff. And I had tried some color experiments, but yeah, my work is pretty much just, it's going to be the way it is. Yeah, it was not going to be changing anytime soon. I can't, there's some, I mean, I guess I'm always attracted to some of the underground cartoonists. When I say underground, it's not, I don't know, I guess less commercial cartoonists. In France, there's a lot of, I don't even know what the right terms would be, but there's some interesting underground work or alternative work or non-commercial work that comes out. So I like looking at that work. Work that's not trying to sell anything, I suppose. So that's not a very good answer, but.
Just from a process standpoint, you tend to populate your panels with quite a lot of black. I've always wondered, do you approach it just from the shapes to begin with and then apply the black as shadow and element, or do you ever work in reverse, white on black?
No, yeah, everyone thinks it would be the logical thing to do, kind of a scratchboard technique, to pull the whites out of the black. But no, it's always from white to black. So it's very simple tools. It's just like making lines and building up those blacks. But that's the way I work. I showed a little of that, but when I'm constructing the pages and designing the pages, I'm always thinking about how a book works and how a book is read. So you're thinking about two-facing pages, and I'm always designing that in mind, how you read a book and how the two pages play off of each other. So it's very clear in Black Hole that each of the pages are almost, or they're always playing off of each other. They're mirroring each other, or they're playing off of each other. So I design the pages in very rough thumbnails, very rough sketches, and then everything really starts in very rough form and slowly materializes. And that has to do with the writing as well. I write everything down in crappy notebooks. I make an enormous amount of notes, and I repeat myself. Sometimes I'll think I've found an amazing solution to some passage that I'm working on, and I go back in my notebook and I see that I wrote the exact same lines down 6 months earlier. So it's that kind of struggle of taking all this material and slowly refining it. That has to do with my drawing style as well as the writing style. So I didn't have examples really, but when I'm working, I do very gestural drawings, and I'm just building shapes, and everything is built up internally. It's slowly formed. So you're drawing, in pencil at first, and then more refined line, and then the final marks are made with a brush on paper. So I'm using a light box, so the image, the final drawing is on a light box. I draw that out and ink everything up. So that's how I work. It takes too long, unfortunately, but that's the way my brain works. So that's the technique, this convoluted technique that I've come up with. Anybody else? Oh, there's a person right there. No, he was always someone who kind of dabbled in different things. I guess the primary influence was that those things were not frowned down upon. He was interested in pretty mainstream American daily comic strips. So some of the things I showed you that were in the notebooks that he had, that would be an example of the things that he was clipping from newspapers or looking at. Which again, it was like Terry and the Pirates, very mainstream sort of adventure comics. But when he was working on projects, there always something. He would do sculpture, but it would be a copy of something. So he never really created characters of his own. If he was doing a watercolor, it would be a watercolor based on someone else's drawing. So I was aware of that side of it. So he just had an interest in those things. The one thing that was really nice is I had access to those tools very early on. I knew that I had books that kind of explained what tools you were supposed to use. If you were a cartoonist, you had to work in India ink with pens and so on. So what was nice is that I had access to those things and could experiment early on. I did, you have to do really bad versions until you slowly get a little better. There was a certain line quality that I liked, the line quality you have now, which is this kind of tapering fluid line. I had no idea that was created with a brush. So I would use a pen and draw one side of the line, draw the other side of the line, fill that in, until I realized that someone said, oh, that's a brush. So just do it that way, one mark. So yeah, my father's still alive, and he still likes comics. I just bought him a collection of Prince Valiant, so it was like his last gift from me. So yeah, he still enjoys it. I think that the subject matter of my comics probably is a little bothersome for him. At some point, I remember when Black Hole was coming out, I said, I'm not going to give you this book. You can search it out on your own. If I give it to you, that means that I condone you reading it. So you can, just don't let my mom read this, is what I told him. So there you go. I was a little bit like, I was talking about meeting Iggy Pop when I did this album cover. He was like saying, yeah, this new album's coming out, but I don't know what my mom's going to think, because I swear on, I think, like, are you kidding? You're Iggy Pop and you're worrying about what your mom thinks? But there's something kind of sweet about that. Anyway, I use the F word a lot. I don't know what mom's going to think. Right here.
You've talked a lot about your visual influences and how you go through that, but it's kind of interesting how you're able to make good use out of your writing as well. First off, do you find that daunting as a part of the process, because you're unique that you do both parts? And then also, second question is, where do you find influence for your writing, for your stories?
Yeah, I think that most cartoonists that I admire do both. I know that there's a tradition, especially in America, of kind of breaking up that, in the commercial comics, of having someone that writes, someone that draws, someone that inks, someone that letters. But the people that I really admire, Alison Bechtel came here, Linda Berry, Art Spiegelman, Dan Clowes, Chris Ware, the people that I think are amazing artists and writers, they do both those things. And good comics are really that there's something there. It's not prose, it's not film, it's not illustration. It's combining words and pictures in a way that tells a story that's totally unique. That being said, I think that there's cartoonists that come from a very visual side, which I would put myself in that side, and then there was cartoonists that are much more from the literary or the I don't know, the prose side. And I think that I really did have to teach myself to tell stories. The writing part was something that I won't say it was. I mean, I had stories to tell, but it took me a while to really learn how to tell a story well, I think. And as far as like writing influences, that's a harder thing for me to nail down as far as a direct influence. I can't think of a really specific author that I can think of. In this book here, in the book that I'm working on most recently, X'd Out, I use William Burroughs as he's certainly an influence there in the story, but that's primarily because the protagonist is going through a certain period of his life that I went through, and I'm basing it on some of my experiences. So there was a certain point where I was reading a lot of William Burroughs, and I really responded to his very kind of dark humor and his very, I don't know, this kind of visceral, very visual writing style that I appreciated, especially at that point in my life. And I also am using some of his kind of collaging techniques that he did as well. It's harder to come up with like someone I can directly think of. I guess I can think of someone like Ernest Hemingway that would tell very clear, very lucid short stories. I don't know, that was someone I responded to early on, and but there's not that direct correlation there. It's hard to say. There was someone that was right here. No, okay.
You mentioned the Zap comics, and I know in later issues, Crumb did a lot of like jams with Wilson and Moscoso and stuff. Have you ever considered collaborating in such a fashion with some
I
people?
actually have, yeah. I have with, I've done, I mean, the thing, what you're talking about is a group of cartoonists get together and they basically pass a page around and add to each other's drawings. And it's fun to do. It's kind of a social situation. Cartooning for me anyway is this very solitary activity. It's me sitting in a room and I can spend 8 hours, 9 hours by myself, working by myself. And that's the kind of person I am. I'm fine with that. I have no problem with that. But occasionally it's really nice to socialize, especially with other cartoonists. And that, yeah. So for me, I find, there's a dividing line there. It's a little more lightweight, but it's fun, and it's fun to see what other people come up with. So I've done strips with Art Spiegelman. I've done a number of things with Gary Panter. I did a piece with a French artist called Kielhofer. So usually it's almost the way I just described. You're sitting and having coffee or drinks or whatever it is, and you're passing. It's fun. It's looking over someone's shoulder, and it's a social activity. But it's just that. Yeah, it's fun. Don't know.
Like one of the motifs I kind of got out of a bunch of your illustrations, at least, were like the wounds and how it's like very gruesome. Do they ever bother you drawing it, or because
there's been times where it's maybe it's just the ideas that I've come up with, but especially I know in retrospect I know there was a certain period where I didn't think I was censoring myself, but there was certainly some censorship. I was self-censoring to a certain degree, and when I worked on Black Hole, I really made this effort not to censor myself. So when I was writing and thinking through ideas, I really worked hard to delve into subject matter that was difficult for me. Difficult. I mean, it was revealing. It was revealing a lot about myself too, or it felt like it to me. I know that Dan Clowes, another cartoonist that I admire, was saying a good story is a story where you reveal a little bit more about yourself than you feel comfortable. And that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to be as honest as I could. I was really trying to put myself into the characters. And there were certainly passages where I thought, I don't know if I can draw this. I don't know if I can do this. And it wasn't so much, it seemed kind of overwhelming. Like it was too much there. So there was not so much to do with something gruesome, but maybe something that was just kind of, I don't know, overwhelming emotionally. I don't know how to explain that. But I really made an effort to get it out there. It's the best I can say.
Are there still plans to make Black Hole into a movie? And if so, what are your thoughts on adapting your work into film?
That's a good question. Yeah, Paramount Pictures had an option on Black Hole since about a year after the book came out. That recently, I think they've gone through how many periods? Anyway, there's still interest. They're still working on it. It's Hollywood, so for a while, David Fincher was attached as the director for a while, and then, as far as I know right now, there's a script that has been written. They think they've got a director, and they think that they've got a new. Well, it used to be Paramount. I think they've got. I can't remember the name of the. Anyway, I get periodic phone calls, and it's a very funny Hollywood. All that Hollywood talk is real, and I can't mimic it. I was writing down phrases and reading them to my wife after talking on the phone last time, and I was like, I can't remember, just some really good Hollywood phrases. But yeah, that's still being worked out. As far as how I feel about it, my feeling is, gee, I sure hope they make a good movie. And my feeling is that I kind of doubt a movie will be made. That's just because it's Hollywood. So I don't know. I've done one, I've worked on one movie, and it was a good experience. I don't know that I'd do it again. I was working with a small production company in France, and it was really under ideal circumstances. They really wanted they wanted my vision to be there up on the screen. I was involved in every aspect of the production, including sound effects. That was fun. But what I realized while I was working on it is that it's such a collaborative medium. You're just so reliant on other people for the final product. The one thing that's great about comics is that you're responsible for everything. You can do everything yourself. For Black Hole, I designed the cover. I was able to choose the paper stock, the binding, all those things. I mean, I really had control of, like, that object was mine. And if there was any problems with it, if it was a crappy story, then that's my fault. So that's what I really like about it. I also like the fact that it's something that anyone can do. You can sit at a table with a felt tip pen and a piece of paper, and you can do a story. I like that about comics. So as far as a movie goes, yeah, I'm hoping for the best, but it's not a world that I'm very concerned about, to tell the truth. I mean, I concern myself about the story, something that I have control over. And I know that if I got involved, I would make myself crazy. So that's about it. Yeah. Someone's got the mic, so they're in charge.
I was wondering if you had any memories related to reading National Lampoon magazine in the 70s.
Sure, yeah.
Because there was some pretty interesting cartoons in that magazine that were along the lines of stuff that came out later, I thought.
It was kind of like the next stage up from Mad magazine. So sure, yeah, I was always looking at everything that was out there. And as I mentioned before, there were not that many outlets for comics and cartoons, so I was always keeping my eyes peeled. There was actually a little comics section in the back of National Lampoon for a while that I tried to send to my comics. I'm actually glad that they actually accepted the comics and then rejected the comics. So in retrospect, I'm glad that they rejected the comics. It was pretty bad.
I remember a Dog-Faced Boy. Live action.
It's called Dog Boy, but yeah. So the character that I was showing you on my slides, there was a short-lived MTV series called Liquid Television, where someone was reminding me about Beavis and Butthead, which is going to be revived recently, but that premiered on the show as well. So it was 10 episodes of a live-action story that I actually wrote, but it was directed by this British director, using British actors who were trying to be American, having American accents. So I guess they sounded okay to him, but they sounded really strange to me. And also he was directing it and kind of ran out of money after a while. So I had the script, and then there was just whole scenes that I didn't include because he ran out of money. So I was like, well, what about this scene and this? We couldn't film that. And so when I finally saw everything put together, I couldn't understand the story that I had written. So it wasn't a good sign for me anyway. So we'll do 2 more. Does that sound good? The microphone's whirling around.
Would you tell us anything about your recent projects?
About my
most recent projects, your
The
latest
most recent
working?
project is, you saw X'd Out, which is a book that came out in 2010. The next book is a continuation of that. There'll be 3 volumes in all. So that's coming out in October. So it'll be three books in all. I'm working on the 3rd. And when it's all put together, it really tells one big, long story. A few other little side projects, but that's primarily what I'm working on right now. Got one more question. There's the one right in the center there that's been holding her hand up for a long time.
I was wondering if you had any advice for anyone who wanted to become a cartoonist, and what that process is like to kind of get started.
My advice would be to, I'm not going to even be able to verbalize it very well. My advice is like not to think about what's commercially viable, but think about what you care about. If you're trying to do the next, I don't know, Buffy the Vampire Slayer adaptation or whatever it is that you think is going to be a commercial hit, the chances are it's just not going to be very interesting for you or for anybody else. I would say to draw and write about what you care about or something that is going to sustain you. If you approach it as a commercial project, you can do that. But it's my advice is to approach it for your personal satisfaction to begin with. And like again, the people that I admire are telling good stories, and the reason they're good stories is because they're heartfelt and they care about them and they've worked their asses off, creating those things. And you have to have something to sustain you. You have to have something that, at the end of the day that you're happy with, that feels like it came from you, and it's not something, I don't know, a roller derby vampire story with, I don't know, something that you care about. That's my best advice. Oh, we got one very last, no, very last one right here.
Dark imagery, black hole. But as I was just reading Black Hole, I couldn't help put it alongside a couple of other things I've been studying, which was Eraserhead by David Lynch and William Kentridge's re-envisioning of Jari's Ubu, which reminded me of Knit Knit. So I was just wondering, I see in common predominantly is this world like sort of jumbled with lack of these characters almost becoming objects damned by their own sort of efficacy towards this loved object that they'll never touch, So I was wondering if you could share any personal, like if this has been in your head this whole time since the beginning, or is it something that's just been really bugging you during Black Hole?
I don't know. I'm not even sure if I fully understand the question. I mean, you're comparing it to a couple other pieces. But what was the primary the question that
it seems like we're in Big Baby, you see this drawer with just tons of toys that are just terrifying and cool at the same time, and then later in Black Hole his room is just strewn with like almost the new version of that drawer kind of, and but it's just all sort of junk. It seems
me,
yeah. But at the same time it seems like everything is so stressful regarding like vaginal images and phallic images, and these characters, like the men look like a phallic because they're just like going after this vaginal image, So
I'm here. I'm trying to.
And
okay.
I'm just wondering where, like, in this like world of like lacking desire, where everything is just built up around the lack. I'm wondering if there's been some. Go ahead.
It must have to do with what I was saying before. Maybe, I mean, obviously says something about me. My wife was saying, I can't remember what it was. She was looking at the animated movie I did, and she said, "That looks like me. You're doing a story about me." I said, "No, I wrote that story, before I even knew you." But sure enough, she said, short hair and looking too masculine or something. I don't know. I mean, all the stories, there's obsessions and ideas they come back to again and again, and you're talking about some of the vaginal imagery and these kind of very obvious phallic imagery. In some cases, I'm really playing with that, kind of doing obviously over-the-top Freudian imagery that's just fun to play with. But again, kind of is built into the texture of the story. So if you're out in the woods, you're seeing this very kind of rich texture, and I don't know. but I don't know if I can explain what, what you're getting after, or what your question is.
Okay.
So that's the best I can do.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Good.